A powerful mafia boss wakes up in a private hospital room after a shooting. His family stands around him, waiting to see what he remembers. His lawyer wants signatures, his nephew wants control, his own son wants answers. But Vincent Moretti remembers more than they think, so he makes one dangerous decision. He pretends to have amnesia, not to play a game, but to see who will protect him when he looks weak, and who will reach for the throne. Then his secretary walks in. She does not cry. She does not ask if he remembers her. Her first words remind him of a promise he made before power turned him into a feared man. And those words bring him to tears. Welcome to a channel about mafia boss stories, where some men are born to rule, and some lessons are never taught in school. This channel does not glorify crime. It reveals mindset, courage, loyalty, and the hidden truths behind real power. This story teaches us that loyalty is not proven when someone is strong, but when they are vulnerable. Watch until the end, and if this story speaks to you, comment where you are watching from, share it with someone who values loyalty, and subscribe for more powerful mafia boss stories.
The rain came down hard over Manhattan that night, the kind of cold November rain that made the city lights look blurred and broken. Outside the Grand Belmont Hotel, cameras flashed against the wet pavement while reporters called out the same name again and again. Mr. Moretti. Mr. Moretti, one more question. Vincent Moretti did not turn around. He moved through the noise in a black suit, his silver hair combed back, his face unreadable beneath the hotel lights. At 52, Vincent still carried himself like a man people instinctively stepped away from. He did not rush, he did not look nervous, he did not need to. Men like Vincent Moretti did not survive 30 years on the New Jersey waterfront by showing the world when they were tired. 3 steps behind him, Evelyn Hart kept pace with a leather folder tucked under one arm. She was 45, dressed in a dark wool coat, her hair pinned low at the back of her neck, her expression calm in a way that made nervous men more nervous. For 12 years, Evelyn had been called Vincent Moretti's secretary, though everyone who worked in his office knew the title was too small for what she did. She knew which calls to answer, which meetings to erase, which favors were debts, and which debts were better left unpaid until the right moment. As they passed the last line of photographers, she leaned closer and said, "The clinic payroll goes out Friday, and the widow's fund renews Monday." Vincent did not look at her. "You remind me of that every week, because every week," Eve said, "someone in your family tries to cut it." For half a second, the corner of Vincent's mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. With Vincent, it rarely was. But Eve had worked for him long enough to know the difference between silence and amusement. "The clinic stays funded," he said. "That is what you said last week, and the week before, and the week before that," Eve replied. Vincent finally glanced at her. "Then why do you keep reminding me?" "Because promises are easier to keep when someone refuses to let you forget them." Something changed in his face when she said that. Not much. A stranger would not have noticed, but Eve did. His eyes moved away from the cameras and toward the waiting black sedan at the curb. Then the first shot cracked through the rain. For one frozen second, nobody moved. The sound bounced off the hotel walls, sharp and impossible. Then the second shot came, and the world broke open. A black car rolled slowly past the entrance, its back window lowered just enough for a gun barrel to appear. Vincent's guards reacted, but not fast enough. One man went down near the curb, another shoved toward Vincent, shouting something Eve could not understand over the screaming crowd. Vincent turned, reaching instinctively for Eve, but the third shot caught him high in the shoulder. The force spun him backward. His head struck the open edge of the sedan door with a sickening sound, and he collapsed onto the rain-soaked pavement. People screamed. Cameras dropped. Men shouted into radios. Eve did not scream. She went down beside Vincent, pressing one hand hard against the wound in his shoulder while the other grabbed his wrist. His pulse was there, rough but strong. Blood warmed her palm despite the cold rain. "Call Dr. Cole," she snapped at the nearest guard. "Private entrance, no press. No family until I clear the room." The guard stared at her like he had forgotten language now. Eve said. That moved him. Vincent's eyes opened halfway. Rain ran down the side of his face. For the first time in 12 years, Eve saw confusion there, real confusion, pain too. He tried to speak, but only a rough breath came out. Eve leaned closer, keeping pressure on the wound. Stay with me, Mr. Moretti. You still owe your mother a promise. His eyes fixed on her for one brief moment. Then they closed. When Vincent woke again, the world was white light and machine noise. His shoulder burned, his skull throbbed with a deep, punishing ache. For a moment, he did not move. He let the sounds come to him first. The steady rhythm of a monitor, the hush of expensive hospital ventilation, footsteps beyond the door. He knew where he was before he opened his eyes fully. Private room, restricted floor, north side of the hospital. Dr. Hannah Cole's territory. He remembered the hotel, the rain, the gunfire, Eve's hand over his wound. He remembered his name. He remembered everything that mattered. Then he heard voices outside the door. Miles Grady spoke first. The family lawyer always sounded calm, even when he was sharpening a knife. If the cognitive damage is serious, the incapacity clause can be triggered within 72 hours. Vincent kept his eyes closed. Adrian Moretti answered in a lower voice. Then we need him confused long enough to sign nothing and remember less. A long silence followed. Vincent lay still beneath the hospital sheets. His breathing even, his face slack. The pain in his head sharpened, but beneath it something colder came awake. So that was the game. The shooting had not only been an attempt on his life, it had been a door. If he died, they would mourn him with black suits and divide his kingdom before the flowers wilted. If he lived but looked broken, they could do something better. They could call it protection. They could call it family duty. They could take the empire legally, with clean hands and signed papers. Vincent opened his eyes halfway as the door moved. Adrian came in first. His nephew wore grief well, not perfectly, but well enough for people who wanted to believe him. His suit was dark, his eyes red at the edges, his mouth pulled tight with concern. He crossed to the bed and lowered his voice. Uncle Vin. Vincent looked at him. Adrian took his hand. Do you know who I am? Vincent let the silence stretch. He watched the hunger hiding behind Adrian's worry. Then he spoke, his voice rough. No, Adrian's face twisted with pain. At least, that was what it was supposed to look like. But Vincent saw the flicker beneath it. Relief. Satisfaction. A man seeing a locked door finally crack open. Miles entered next, carrying a slim folder. Vincent, he said gently, too gently. You gave us quite a scare. Vincent stared at him as if trying to place the face. Miles stepped closer. There are a few temporary forms we may need to discuss later. Nothing urgent, only to protect your wishes while you recover. Vincent's gaze drifted down. The pen was already in Miles's hand. Then Luca entered. That was the part Vincent had not prepared himself for. His son looked younger than 27 in that moment. Pale, angry, afraid. Luca stopped near the foot of the bed, as if he did not know whether he had the right to come closer. Dad. His voice broke slightly. Do you remember me? Vincent looked at his son, and for 1 second the act became heavier than the wound in his shoulder. Luca was not like Adrian. Luca's pain was real. Whatever else had gone wrong between them, this was real. But Vincent had already chosen the lie. I'm sorry, he said. Luca looked away fast, but not fast enough to hide what it did to him. The room fell into a cruel kind of silence. Then the door opened again. Evelyn Hart stepped inside. She had changed clothes, but the sleeve of her coat still carried a faint dark stain near the cuff. Vincent's blood. Her hair was neat, though not perfect. Her face was tired. Her eyes were not. She did not rush to the bed. She did not ask what the doctors said. She did not ask if he remembered her. Instead, she looked at Miles, then at the folder, then at the pen in his hand. After that, she looked at Vincent. For a moment, nobody spoke. Eve walked to the side of the bed, close enough that he could see the rain still drying at the hem of her coat. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, calm, clear. Mr. Moretti, before you remember my name, remember this. The clinic payroll goes out Friday. The Widow's Fund renews Monday. And if your family tells you to save the empire, you told me to save the people first. The words hit Vincent harder than the bullet. Not because they were dramatic. They were not. Eve had spoken them the way she spoke every practical thing that needed doing. But that was why they hurt. She had not come into the room asking what was left of the boss. She had not reached for his money, his signature, his authority, or his fear. She had reached for the one promise he had buried so deep that most days even he could pretend not to feel it. His mother's clinic. His mother's dying voice. If you cannot save your soul, Vincent, save someone else's child. Vincent turned his face toward the window. But the tear fell before he could stop it. Adrian saw it, Miles saw it, Luca saw it, and Eve saw it, for one dangerous second. Vincent wondered if she knew, if she had heard the false note in his confusion, if she understood that his mind was not as broken as he was pretending it to be. But Eve did not expose him. She placed a folder on the bedside table and said, "Until Dr. Cole clears him, no papers. No signatures, no private visitors." Those were his written instructions before the shooting. Miles's face hardened. "You are a secretary, Miss Hart." "Yes," Eve said. "That is why I know exactly where the instructions are." No one answered her. She turned to leave. Vincent forced himself to speak, keeping his voice weak. "Who are you?" Eve stopped at the door. For the first time since entering the room, something almost sad moved across her face. "Evelyn Hart," she said. "Your secretary." Then she opened the door, paused, and added without looking back, "And for the record, sir, you never cry in front of strangers." The door closed behind her. Vincent lay still in the hospital bed, his shoulder burning, his head pounding, his son wounded, his enemies circling, and the taste of one tear still drying on his face. He had started the lie to test loyalty, but Evelyn Hart had walked into that room and reminded him of something far more dangerous than betrayal. She had reminded him that someone still remembered the man he was before the world taught him to become untouchable. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the city still looked wet and wounded through the hospital window. Vincent Moretti lay in the private room, with the blinds half closed, a bandage wrapped around his shoulder and a dull, steady pain behind his eyes. The doctors had called it a concussion. They were not wrong. His head throbbed every time he moved too quickly, and there were a few seconds from the night before that still came back in broken pieces. Headlights in the rain, the sound of gunfire, Evelyn's hand pressing down on his wound. But Vincent knew his name. He knew his enemies. He knew the difference between injury and weakness. More importantly, he knew the people outside that room were already measuring how much of him was left to take. Dr. Hannah Cole stood beside his bed with a tablet in one hand and a look on her face that told him she had no patience for his performance. Hannah had treated Vincent long enough to know when he was in pain, when he was lying, and when he was doing both at the same time. She checked the light response in his eyes, asked him simple questions, and waited until the nurse left before she spoke in her real voice. "You remember more than you let them think." Vincent looked toward the door. "Enough." Hannah's mouth tightened. "Enough to stop pretending." He turned his head slowly back to her. "Enough to know I shouldn't." Hannah set the tablet down. "You were shot. You hit your head hard enough to lose consciousness. This is not a card game, Vincent." He gave her a tired look. "Everything is a card game if the wrong people are holding the table." She exhaled through her nose, irritated because she knew he had already decided. "Your concussion is real," she said. "You push this too far and you could miss symptoms that matter. Blurred vision, confusion, memory gaps, nausea. You need rest, not theater." Vincent's eyes stayed flat. "What I need is 72 hours. Hannah folded her arms. "For what?" "To see who comes for the man and who comes for the chair." She studied him for a long moment. "And Evelyn?" Vincent did not answer. That silence told Hannah more than any confession could have. "If she turns against you," the doctor said quietly, "you don't lose the empire. You lose the one person in that building who still sees you as human. That is what scares you." Vincent looked away first. Across the river, Evelyn Hart returned to the Moretti office just before 8. The building sat behind smoked glass and quiet security, the kind of place that looked respectable from the street and dangerous from the inside. By the time she stepped off the elevator, everyone already knew Vincent had been shot. More than that, everyone had heard the whisper that mattered. He might not remember. Fear had a smell in an office like that. So did opportunity. Eve could feel both before she reached her desk. The phone lines were already blinking. A dock supervisor wanted to know if the Friday agreement still stood. A construction partner asked whether all current approvals were paused until family review. A cousin Eve had not heard from in 8 months suddenly wanted to discuss access to an emergency account. Miles Grady's assistant had sent 3 messages requesting copies of Vincent S. medical directives and temporary authority documents. Eve read everything once, then she took off her coat, hung it neatly behind her chair, and began closing doors before the wrong people could walk through them. She locked non-essential account access under the emergency protocol Vincent himself had written 5 years earlier. She sent a notice suspending all executive signatures for 96 hours pending medical clearance. She copied the clinic payroll file, marked it urgent, and released the payment before anyone could freeze the account. She renewed the widow's fund for the month, attached the old authorization, and sent a confirmation to the clinic board. Her young assistant, Beth, hovered by the desk, pale and unsure. "Shouldn't we wait for the family to approve this?" Beth asked. Eve did not look up from the screen. Family is not a procedure. By 10. Adrian Moretti arrived with 2 men Eve did not recognize and a smile she disliked immediately. He wore grief better in public than he did in private. "Evelyn," he said, as if they were old friends. "You must be exhausted." "I'm functional," she replied. "That is usually more useful." Adrian's smile held, but his eyes cooled. "I need access to my uncle's pending contracts. The family has to keep things stable." Eve slid one sheet across the desk. "All pending contracts are frozen until Dr. Cole confirms his capacity. He may not have capacity for some time. Then the freeze remains useful." Adrian leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You understand things are changing." Eve finally looked at him. "People keep saying that when what they mean is they are hoping I forgot the rules." He laughed softly. "You're in a difficult position. Vincent trusted you, but if he can't remember why, that creates questions. Only for people who benefit from asking them." His jaw moved once. Then he placed both hands on her desk, as if the room belonged to him already. "I can protect your position, your salary, your access. But I need cooperation." Eve opened a folder and removed a copy of the clinic transfer. "Which part of my cooperation troubles you most, Adrian? The children's medication, or the rent your uncle covered for the widow after your cousin got her husband killed on a job site?" The room went still. Adrian had not known about that payment. That was his first mistake. His second was letting her see that he had not known. He straightened. The smile gone now. "You are very brave while he is still breathing." Eve closed the folder. "No, I'm very organized. At the hospital." Vincent watched the office feed from a secure monitor Rosa Bell had arranged through the estate's existing system. It showed only public work areas. Nothing illegal, nothing private but enough. He saw Adrian leave Eve's desk with anger hidden under polish. He saw Miles' courier arrive and leave empty-handed. He saw Beth standing beside Eve like a frightened bird, while Eve worked with the calm precision of a woman, holding a roof up during a storm. Nobody thanked her. Half the office was probably afraid of her. Still, she kept going. Vincent stared at the screen longer than he meant to. It occurred to him, not for the first time, but more painfully than before, that Eve had never needed him to look strong in order to do her job. She was not protecting him because he was untouchable. She was protecting the pieces of his world that were still worth saving while everyone else circled the parts they could sell. By late afternoon, Luca Moretti came to the office. Eve knew from his face that grief had turned to anger because anger was easier to carry. He stopped in front of her desk, looking at the locked file cabinet, the suspended access notices, the calm stack of documents waiting for signatures no one would receive. "You blocking me from my own father," he said. Eve stood slowly. "I am blocking everyone from making decisions your father cannot safely review." Luca's eyes flashed. "I am not everyone, I am his son." "Yes," Eve said. "And today that makes you hurt, not objective." The words landed harder than she expected. Luca stepped closer. "You not family." Eve did not flinch. "No, that is why I can still read this room clearly." His face tightened. "You think you know him better than I do." Eve was quiet for a moment. Then she opened her drawer and took out a sealed envelope with Luca's name on it. "6 months ago, your father asked me to arrange this. He never gave it to you because he did not know how." Luca snatched it from her and opened it. Inside was a private appointment confirmation with a trauma counselor, paid for in advance under an anonymous account. The note attached was in Vincent's handwriting. For when he is ready, do not push him. Luca stared at the paper for a second. He looked like a boy trying not to cry in a room full of adults. Eve softened her voice. Your father is terrible at tenderness, but he is not empty. Luca folded the paper badly, his hands unsteady. Then why does he make it so hard to know that? Eve had no easy answer. Because some men spend so long surviving that they forget being loved requires translation. That evening, after the office emptied and the city outside turned golden gray, Miles Grady called Adrian from his car. His voice was calm, but there was strain beneath it. She blocked the signatures, she secured the clinic, she renewed the widow's fund, she knows every emergency protocol. Adrian said nothing. Miles continued. As long as that woman sits in that chair, your uncle is not weak enough. Adrian watched the lights of the Moretti building from across the street. Behind one of those windows, Evelyn Hart was still at her desk, still working, still standing between them and everything they wanted. His voice went low. Then what do we do? Miles answered without hesitation. We removed the chair. Vincent Moretti left the hospital 3 days after the shooting, not because Dr. Hannah Cole believed he was ready, but because Vincent had never been a man who waited for permission when danger was already inside his house. The official statement said he would continue recovery at the Moretti estate under private medical supervision. The news vans outside the hospital called it a sign of strength. The men watching from darker corners of the city called it something else. An opening. The Moretti estate sat behind iron gates on a quiet stretch of Old Money Road in New Jersey, far enough from the waterfront to pretend it was respectable, close enough for Vincent to see the lights of the port from the second-floor windows on a clear night. It was a beautiful house if a person did not know what kind of decisions had been made inside it. White stone, tall windows, dark wood. Rooms so large they made grief look small. That afternoon, every room felt occupied by people pretending they were there because they cared. Adrian walked beside Vincent as two guards helped him into the main hall. Easy, Uncle Vin, he said, his voice warm enough for witnesses. You home now. Vincent let his eyes move over the foyer slowly, as if the place were familiar but distant. He paused at the portrait of his mother above the staircase. Rose Moretti looked down from the frame with the same calm sadness she had carried in life. For a moment, the performance almost slipped. Then Vincent turned to Adrian and asked, Is this my house? Adrian's hand tightened briefly at his side. Yes, of course it is. Rosa Bell stood near the staircase, hands folded in front of her, watching everything. She had worked in that house before Vincent became a man people feared. She had wiped mud from his shoes when he was 12. She had watched him bury his mother, then bury softness piece by piece afterward. Now she watched him pretend not to know his own walls. And her eyes narrowed in a way that told him she was not fooled. Evelyn Hart arrived 20 minutes later with 2 boxes of files and no apology for being late. She walked into the front hall in a dark gray coat, her face composed, her heels quiet on the marble. Adrian looked at the boxes first, then at her. Moving in, Miss Hart? No, Eve said, preventing others from moving things out. Rosa almost smiled. Vincent stood near the sitting room door, one arm in a sling, his face pale beneath the bruising near his temple. Eve glanced at him just long enough to note his color, his balance, the strain around his mouth. Then she looked away. That was one of the things Vincent had always noticed about her. She saw too much, but she never made a performance of seeing it. Mr. Moretti, she said, as if nothing had changed. Your medication is due in 20 minutes. Dr. Cole canceled all meetings for the day. I canceled them twice, since several people pretended not to receive the first notice. Vincent tilted his head slightly. Do I know you? The room went quiet. Adrian watched closely. Eve did not blink, not as well as you should. For one sharp second, Vincent nearly smiled. He covered it by looking confused. Adrian stepped in. Uncle Vin has had a difficult few days. Maybe keep things simple for him. Eve turned her eyes to him. I am. The first test came that evening in the library. Vincent had asked to sit there, because it was the one room in the house where most people lowered their voices without being told. The shelves rose to the ceiling. The curtains were half drawn. A fire burned low in the grate, more for atmosphere than warmth. Eve stood by the desk with a legal pad in her hand, reviewing the next morning's restrictions. No signing, no outside calls without review, no family meetings without Dr. Cole present. Vincent let her finish, then looked toward the painting beside the bookcase. Behind it was a safe only 3 people knew about: Vincent, Eve, and the man who had installed it, who was no longer alive. "I need something from there," Vincent said, nodding toward the painting. Eve followed his gaze. "No, you don't. I don't remember the code. That would be another reason not to open it." He leaned back, studying her. "But you remember it." "Yes." "Then open it." Eve closed the legal pad slowly. She knew exactly what this was. He could see it in the stillness of her face. Not anger, not fear. Disappointment, maybe. Or something close to it. "If you don't remember the code, sir," she said, "then you also don't remember why you told me never to open it for you." Vincent kept his voice low and uneven, still playing the injured man. "What if I order you? Then I remind you that you hired me to stop you from making expensive mistakes." The fire cracked softly between them. Vincent looked at her for a long time. Inside the safe were bearer bonds, insurance documents, a hard drive containing half the sins of the waterfront, and enough cash to make a weaker person curious. Evelyn Hart had known the code for years. She had never once used it without him standing beside her. Even now, with him pretending to be broken, she would not take what was not hers to touch. Before he could answer, the library door opened and Luca stepped inside. He looked from Vincent to Eve, and something ugly crossed his face. "Am I interrupting?" "Yes," Eve said. Vincent lowered his eyes, pretending not to understand the tension. Luca walked farther into the room. "I need to talk to my father, then talk," Eve said. "But nothing gets signed, moved, transferred, or promised." Luca laughed once, bitterly. "You really do think you run this house?" "No," Eve replied. "I think someone has to keep it from being looted while your father is recovering." "My father," Luca repeated, "not yours." Eve said nothing, and somehow that made him angrier. The next morning, Miles Grady made his move. He did not come to the estate himself. Men like Miles preferred distance when poison was being poured. Instead, he sent a courier with a sealed packet addressed to Luca. The documents inside showed a series of transfers from Moretti accounts to outside entities over several years. The descriptions had been changed just enough to look dirty: unauthorized distributions, discretionary withdrawals, unapproved relief payments. At the bottom of the summary, Evelyn Hart's name appeared again and again. Adrian made sure Luca saw it before anyone else. By noon, Luca came to Eve's office with the packet in his fist. His face was flushed, his voice low. "Tell me this is fake." Eve took the first page, scanned it once, and knew immediately what Miles had done. He had taken clean payments and dressed them in mud: clinic medicine, widow support, school tuition, emergency rent. He had removed the people from the paper so only the money remained. "These are real transfers," she said. Luca's face hardened. "And the descriptions are false," she continued. He threw the packet onto her desk. "How convenient." Eve looked up at him. "Luca, if I wanted to steal from your father, I would not start with checks that have invoices attached." He had no answer to that. But anger did not need answers. "You expect me to trust you?" "No," she said. "I expect you to read before you accuse. It is a useful habit. Your father never mastered it emotionally, but legally it kept him alive." That landed in a place Luca did not want touched. He looked away, jaw tight. By nightfall, the house had grown quiet. But quiet in the Moretti estate never meant peace. It meant people had moved their conversations behind closed doors. Eve worked late in the small office outside Vincent's study, sorting copies of the altered transfer records into piles. Real purpose, false label. Original authorization, potential legal exposure. She did not notice the envelope until she reached for her coat. It sat on her chair. No stamp. No return address. Just her name. Eve opened it with a letter opener, not her fingers. Inside were 3 photographs, old and grainy. A wrecked sedan near the waterfront. Broken glass. A white sheet over a body she had loved before the world taught her to survive without him. Thomas Hart. For a moment the room disappeared. Then she saw the note. "Ask Moretti what he remembers about your husband." Eve sat down slowly. Her hand, the same hand that had pressed Vincent's blood into his shoulder without shaking, trembled over the photograph of her dead husband's car. The next morning, she arrived at the estate at 7 sharp. Her coat was buttoned, her hair was neat, her face revealed nothing. Vincent was in the breakfast room, untouched coffee in front of him. He watched her pour a cup from the sideboard. Her hand shook once, barely enough to ripple the surface. He saw it, still playing the role. He asked quietly, "Are you afraid of me?" Eve did not turn around. "No, then who?" She set the coffee pot down and looked at him. "The version of you that might have lied to me for 12 years. Vincent could not answer, not without revealing too much. Across town, Adrian's sat in the back of a black sedan while Miles spoke on speakerphone. "Use the husband," Miles said. "Loyalty weakens when grief is reopened." Adrian looked out at the morning traffic, smiling faintly. "And if she still refuses?" Miles did not hesitate. "Then we make Vincent believe she didn't he." Evelyn Hart had learned a long time ago that grief did not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it came quietly, folded inside a plain envelope, waiting on a chair in an empty office. Sometimes it smelled like old paper and rain-soaked leather. Sometimes it had no voice at all. Just 3 photographs of a wrecked sedan and one sentence sharp enough to cut through 12 years of discipline. "Ask Moretti what he remembers about your husband." By morning, Eve had placed the photographs back into the envelope, sealed it inside a file folder, and gone to work as if the past had not reached up from the grave and grabbed her by the throat. That was one of the first rules she had learned after Thomas died. The world did not stop because your heart did. Bills came due. Phones rang. Men in expensive suits continued lying with clean fingernails. So she pinned her hair, buttoned her coat, and walked into the Moretti's estate at 7 sharp. Vincent saw the difference immediately. She had hidden it well. Too well for most people. Her voice was steady. Her notes were organized. Her postures was as straight as ever. But Vincent had watched Evelyn Hart for 12 years. He knew the weight of her silence. He knew when she was angry, because she became more polite. He knew when she was afraid, because she became more exact. That morning, every word she spoke landed like it had been measured twice before leaving her mouth. He wanted to ask about the envelope. He wanted to ask who had sent it. He wanted to tell her that Thomas Hart's death had never been as simple as the police report made it look. But he could not ask without giving away too much. Not yet. Not while Adrian was still moving. Not while Miles was still invisible behind paperwork. Not while Vincent was still pretending to be a man with holes in his memory. So he sat at the breakfast table with one arm in a sling, pretending to struggle with the name of a cousin he had never liked, while Eve stood near the sideboard and read the day's restrictions aloud. No outside visitors before noon, no signatures. Dr. Cole will examine you at 11. The clinic board has requested a call at 2. But I told them you were not cleared for financial discussion. Adrian, who sat across from Vincent with coffee he had not touched, smiled faintly. "You seem to be making a lot of decisions for a secretary." Eve did not look up from the folder. "I am following written instructions. Written by a man who may not remember writing them. Then it is fortunate someone else does." Vincent lowered his eyes before the wrong expression crossed his face. Adrian watched both of them. His smile stayed in place, but something behind it sharpened. "Miss Hart," he said, "I was hoping we might speak privately later." Eve closed the folder. "About what?" "Your future. My future is scheduled through Friday." Then clear an hour. There were men who threatened with volume. Adrian was not one of them. His danger was cleaner than that. He spoke like a man offering kindness, which made the knife easier to miss if a person was desperate enough to need it. Eve had met hundreds like him. They believed every person had a purchase price. If money did not work, fear would. If fear failed, grief usually did. Eve looked at him for a moment, then she said, 4 o'clock, not here." Adrian seemed pleased, that was his mistake. At 4. She met him at a quiet restaurant on the edge of Hoboken. The kind of place where businessmen ordered expensive lunches and no one looked twice at a private conversation. Adrian was already seated when she arrived. No bodyguards, no visible weapon, just a dark suit, a glass of water, and a leather folder resting on the table between them. He stood when she approached. Eve did not thank him for it. "You came," he said. You asked for an hour. You have 40 minutes. He gave a soft laugh. Always efficient, usually necessary. They sat. A waiter came by. Adrian ordered coffee. Eve ordered nothing. When they were alone again, Adrian rested one hand on the folder. I know you received something last night. Eve's face did not change. Adrian tilted his head. No reaction. That's impressive. That depends on what you were hoping to see. I was hoping for honesty. Then you should try offering some. His smile faded slightly. He opened the folder and slid out a page. It was a copy of an old incident report, one Eve had seen before. Dockside Road, brake failure, fatal impact. Thomas Hart, age 36, husband, father, insurance investigator, dead before paramedics arrived. Eve did not touch the page. Adrian noticed. My uncle knows more about your husband than he ever told you. The words entered her like cold water. She let them sit there. She let them try to move her. Then she folded her hands in her lap and waited. Adrian leaned back. Thomas was looking into warehouse fraud, near the waterfront. Your husband got too close to something powerful. You know that. You've always known that. Eve's voice stayed even. What do you want? He studied her, as if disappointed she had not broken sooner. Vincent is not well. Maybe he recovers. Maybe he does tea. Either way, the family needs structure, stability, someone who understands that the old ways cannot continue. By old ways, you mean the clinic. I mean waste. The clinic treats children. The clinic drains accounts that could protect this family. From what? From men who are not sentimental. Eve almost smiled then, but there was no humor in it. You think cruelty is strategy because you've never had to survive it from the bottom. Adrian's eyes hardened. My uncle has trained you well. No, Eve said. Your uncle trained men to fear silence. Life trained me to use it. For the first time. Adrian's mask slipped. Only a little but enough. He pushed another document toward her. Sign a statement confirming that Vincent is not currently capable of managing his affairs. Not permanently. Just for now. Support the family's petition for temporary authority. In return, the questions about those transfers disappear. Your position is protected, your son stays safe, and I give you the complete file on Thomas. Eve heard Daniel's name and felt something ancient rise in her chest. Her son was 24 now, grown, working long shifts at a hospital while taking night classes. He had his father's gentle eyes, and Eve's habit of pretending exhaustion was not exhaustion. He knew almost nothing about the Moretti world, because Eve had spent 12 years making sure of it. Adrian saw the flicker in her face. This time, he knew he had touched something real. Daniel works late, he said softly. Parking lots are dangerous places, hospitals too, so many people coming and going. Eve looked at him then, fully. Do not mistake a mother's fear for a weak point. It is always a weak point. No, she said, it is a line. Men like you confuse the two because you've never loved anyone without calculating what they were worth. Adrian sat back. The room around them continued, as if nothing had happened. Silverware clicked. A woman laughed softly near the bar, outside the window. Cars moved through wet streets under a gray sky. Loyalty is expensive, Miss Hart, Adrian said. Eve stood. No, she replied. Betrayal is expensive. Loyalty only costs you the illusion that you are the most important person in the room. She left him there with the folder unopened. But walking away was not the same as being untouched. That night, Eve went home and opened the old box she kept at the back of her bedroom closet. She had not touched it in nearly 2 years. Inside were Thomas's things: a cracked leather wallet, his wedding ring, newspaper clippings, printed emails, a copy of the police report, and a photograph of him holding Daniel on his shoulders at the Jersey Shore when their son was 4. Thomas had been laughing in that picture. That was what hurt most. Not the death, not anymore. It was remembering the sound of him before the world became careful and quiet. She sat on the floor beside the bed and read through his notes again. Warehouse numbers, insurance claims, missing inventory, names he had circled and underlined. Miles Grady appeared once, not as an accusation, just as a contact connected to a claim review. At the time, Eve had not known enough to understand the shape of the thing. Later, working for Vincent, she had learned that powerful men rarely stood where the blood landed. They signed forms 3 rooms away and called it distance. Vincent had been at Thomas's funeral. She remembered that now with painful clarity. He had stood in the back of the church in a black coat. silent while others whispered. After the service, he had approached her but not touched her. Vincent never touched grief unless invited. If you ever need work, he had said, call my office. At the time, she had hated him for the offer, hated the calmness of it, hated the money in his voice, even though he had not mentioned money. 3 months later, with bills stacking and Daniel needing stability, she had called. She told herself she wanted answers. That had been true. But truth had a way of changing shape the closer you got to it. Some loyalties were born from love, Evelyn S. was not. Hers began as suspicion, survived disappointment, and slowly became something more dangerous, respect. The next morning, Miles Grady made his second move. A legal notice arrived at the Moretti clinic just after 10. By noon, Eve had a copy in her hands. Certain charitable funds were being temporarily frozen pending review of irregular transfers. The language was clean, professional, and poisonous. It never said the clinic should close. It never said children would miss medication. It never said widows would lose rent support. Paperwork rarely admitted what it was really doing. Eve drove to the clinic herself. The Moretti Clinic sat in a brick building between a laundromat and a closed bakery, far from the marble floors of Vincent S. estate. It smelled of disinfectant, coffee, and old radiator heat. The waiting room was full when Eve arrived. A mother with 2 coughing children, an old dock worker rubbing his wrist, a pregnant woman filling out forms with a borrowed pen. These were not numbers in an account. They were the reason Vincent S. mother had opened the doors in the first place. The clinic director, Margaret Wells, met Eve in the back office with panic written plainly across her face. If the funds stay frozen, we can cover payroll for maybe 4 days. Medication orders are due tomorrow. They will be paid. Eve said, how? I am working on that for 6 hours. Eve did what she had always done. She called donors who owed Vincent favors and spoke to them as if giving was their idea. She negotiated with suppliers for delayed payment. She moved unrestricted emergency money into immediate needs. She drafted a temporary bridge request through a foundation Miles could not touch without exposing why he wanted to touch it. By sunset, the clinic had 1 more week of breathing room. It was not enough, but it was something. As she was leaving, an older nurse named Patricia stopped her near the front desk. Patricia had worked there since Rose Moretti was alive. Her hands were wrinkled, her eyes tired, and her voice gentle in a way that made kindness feel like a burden worth carrying. Mr. Moretti built this place, Patricia said, but you the reason it still opens on time. Eve looked away. For one dangerous moment. Her eyes burned. I send emails, she said. Patricia smiled sadly. No, honey. You remember who the emails are for, outside. Across the street in a dark sedan. Vincent watched Eve step out of the clinic beneath the yellow light of the entrance. He should not have been there. Hannah would have been furious. Rosa, who sat beside him in the back seat, already was. Eve looked exhausted. Not weak. Never weak. But tired in a way Vincent recognized because he had caused that kind of tired in other people for years. She paused beside a woman holding a little boy in a blue jacket. The woman said something Vincent could not hear. Eve listened, then rested a hand briefly on the child's shoulder. Vincent S. driver had picked up the clinic security audio through the open front entrance. Eve's voice came through low but clear. He made a promise, she told the mother. Until I know he broke it, I'm going to keep it. Vincent closed his eyes. Rosabelle turned her head toward him. Still testing her, he said nothing. Rosa looked back at the clinic. Careful, Vincent. There is a point where a test becomes an insult. Vincent opened his eyes again, but Eve was already walking toward her car, alone under the streetlight. Later that night, Eve returned to the Moretti office to collect the clinic files she had left behind. The building was quiet, most lights off except the one over her desk. She set her purse down, removed her coat, and reached for the bottom drawer where she kept older authorization copies. Something small rested on top of the files, a key, old brass, heavy. Not from the office, not from the estate. Eve picked it up and turned it under the lamp. 2 words were engraved along the side, worn but readable. Saint Michael. Her breath caught. She knew that name. Everyone close to Vincent knew it, though almost no one said it out loud. Saint Michael was the church where Rose Moretti had volunteered before she opened the clinic. It was where Vincent had held his mother's funeral. It was where, according to a rumor Eve had never confirmed, Vincent kept things too personal to trust to banks or lawyers. Eve stood alone in the office, the key cold against her palm. Either someone wanted her to find what Vincent had hidden there, or Vincent had prepared for this long before the shooting. For the first time since the hospital room, Eve wondered whether the man pretending to forget had remembered far more than she could survive. St. Michael's Church looked smaller than Evelyn remembered, though she had only seen it from the outside years ago. On the morning of Rose Moretti's funeral, back then the street had been crowded with black cars, gray coats, lowered voices, and men who looked like they had come to mourn but were really there to be seen mourning. Vincent had stood near the front steps that day, still young enough to look like grief could break him, already hard enough to make people keep their distance. Eve had watched from across the street with Thomas's death still fresh inside her, wondering what kind of man could bury his mother in the morning and return to business by afternoon. Now the church was quiet, no black cars, no reporters, no Moretti soldiers at the curb. Just an old brick building with weathered stone steps and a wooden door that groaned when Eve pushed it open. Morning light came through the stained glass in faded strips of blue and red. The air smelled of candle wax, dust, and old wood. For a moment, Eve stood in the back and listened to the silence. She had not been inside a church alone since Thomas died. After his funeral, prayer had felt too much like speaking into an empty room. A priest appeared from a side hallway. He was thin, white-haired, and moved slowly, but his eyes were clear. He looked at Eve as if he had been expecting her. "Mrs. Hart," he said. She tightened her hand around the brass key. "I go by Miss Hart now, of course." He nodded once. "You have the key." Eve lifted it slightly. "I found it in my desk." The priest did not ask who put it there. He only turned and motioned for her to follow. They walked past rows of empty pews toward a small office behind the sanctuary. On the wall hung an old photograph of Rose Moretti standing in front of the clinic with a group of children around her. She was smiling in the picture, not the polished smile of a wealthy woman at a charity event, but the tired, honest smile of someone who had chosen work over comfort and never regretted it. The priest opened a cabinet and removed a small metal box. It was dark with age, heavy enough that both his hands lowered when he passed it to her. Across the top, written on a strip of paper sealed beneath yellowing tape, were 5 words in Vincent's handwriting: "For the person who stays." Eve looked at the box. Her throat tightened, but her face did not change. The priest said softly, "Mrs. Moretti asked that certain things be kept here. Later, Vincent added to them. He said one day someone might come who needed the truth more than permission. Did he say it would be me?" "No," the priest said. But he looked like a man hoping it would be. Eve sat at the small desk, placed the key into the lock, and turned it. The click sounded too loud in the room. Inside were 3 things. The first was a letter in a woman's handwriting, old and delicate, addressed to Vincent. Eve did not open it yet. It felt too private, too sacred, even now. The second was a thick file marked Thomas Hart. Her fingers went cold when she touched it. The third was a folded piece of paper, written in Vincent's hand. But the ink was newer, very new. Eve opened that one first. If Evelyn finds this, she knows enough. Stop testing her. For several seconds, she did not breathe. The room seemed to pull away from her. The priest, the desk, the old photograph, even the church itself, everything narrowed to that one sentence. Stop testing her. So Vincent knew, not everything maybe, not every detail she had seen and heard and pieced together. But enough. Enough to leave the key. Enough to prepare the box. Enough to write the note after the shooting. He was not as lost as he pretended to be. Eve closed her eyes once, not in prayer, but to steady the part of herself that wanted to stand up and walk straight out of the church before the truth could ask anything more from her. Then she opened the Thomas file. At first, it was familiar. Accident report, insurance claim summaries, dockside photographs, weather report, brake failure. She had seen versions of these documents before, the clean public ones that explained nothing and asked her to accept everything. But halfway through the folder, the shape changed. There were copies of internal warehouse records, payment routing notes, Company names she recognized from the Moretti office, and one name that appeared again and again. Always slightly removed from the dirty center but never far enough away. Miles Grady, not as a witness, not as a bystander. As the man who had reviewed the claims before they disappeared. The man who had signed off on the legal cleanup. The man who had buried Thomas's questions under procedural language and then called it closed. Adrian S. name appeared too. Smaller then, younger. Connected to a shell company that had moved money after the claim was settled. Eve stared at the page until the words blurred. Vincent had written notes in the margins, short, controlled. Angry in the way only Vincent could be angry on paper. Too late. No direct proof. Keep Daniel out of reach. Do not tell her until Miles can be cornered. Eve pressed her palm flat against the desk. Do not tell her. There it was. The wound beneath the wound. Vincent had not killed Thomas, she believed that now. The evidence was too clean in the wrong places, too ugly in the right ones. But Vincent had known enough to search, enough to suspect, enough to protect her from danger she had not even been allowed to name. Some part of her understood, a quieter, colder part. Vincent S. World did not forgive loose ends. If Eve had gone after Miles years ago with grief instead of proof, Daniel might have grown up without both parents. But understanding did not soften the anger. He had decided what truth she could carry. He had chosen silence and called it protection. Men like Vincent always did that. They wrapped control in concern and expected gratitude when the cage held. Eve put the papers back into the box with careful hands. When she left the church, the morning had brightened. The city kept moving. Buses hissed at the curb. A delivery truck backed into an alley. Somewhere, a child laughed. The world looked exactly the same as it had before she knew Vincent Moretti had been lying to her by omission for years. By noon, she was back at the estate. Rosabelle opened the front door before Eve could knock. The older woman looked at the metal box in Eve's hands and then at her face. You found it, Rosa said. Yes. Rosa stepped aside. Yes, in the library. Eve walked through the house without asking whether Vincent was alone. People moved out of her way. Perhaps it was the box. Perhaps it was her expression. In 12 years, many of those men had seen Evelyn Hart calm. Few had seen her quiet in this particular way. The library door was half open. Vincent sat near the window, one arm still in the sling, a blanket over his knees that someone else must have placed there. The afternoon light carved hard lines across his face. He looked older than he had at the hotel. Not weaker, just more tired of being made of stone. He did not pretend when he saw the box. That told her everything. Eve closed the door behind her and walked to his desk. She set the metal box down between them. The sound was small, but Vincent flinched as if it had landed on bone. For the first time in 12 years. She did not call him sir. How long were you going to pretend you didn't remember me? Vincent looked at the box, then at her. Until I knew who was moving against me. That was not the question. His jaw tightened. Eva's voice stayed low. How long? Vincent. The use of his name landed harder than anger would have. For a moment, he looked toward the shelves, as if one of the old books might offer him a way out. I remembered enough in the hospital, he said. Enough to cry. His eyes came back to hers. She did not give him mercy. Not yet. And how long were you going to let me grieve a man you knew how to avenge? Vincent's face changed then. Not dramatically. Vincent never broke in ways that satisfied other people. But the coldness thinned. Pain moved underneath. I did not know soon enough, he said. But you knew long enough. He had no answer ready for that. Good. Eve was tired of answers shaped like excuses. I found pieces after Thomas died, Vincent said. Not proof. Pieces. Miles had covered the paper trail before I understood what he'd done. Adrian was involved, but not visibly enough. If I told you then, you would have gone after them. You don't know that. Yes, he said quietly. I do. Eve leaned both hands on the desk. No. You know what you would have done with grief. You never asked what I would have done with truth. Vincent looked away. That hurt more than if he had argued. She straightened. You paid Daniel's school fees, his eyes flickered. You moved money through a foundation. You used a donor name Thomas would not recognize. You made sure I never knew. I did not want him touched. He is my son, I know. No, Eve said, and now her voice did tremble, but not from fear. You know his name. You know his schedule. You know what danger looks like from your side of the glass. But he is my son. And you let me thank strangers for help that came from a man who was hiding the truth about his father's death. Vincent closed his eyes briefly. I was trying to protect you. Eve laughed once, without humor. You do not get to call it protection when the person being protected is never allowed to choose. Silence settled in the library. Outside. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed. The house continued breathing around them, full of men who would never understand that the most dangerous conversation under its roof had no weapons in it. Vincent finally said, I needed to know if you would sell me. Eve stared at him. There it was. The truth beneath the plan. Not strategy, not caution. Fear. No, she said softly. You needed to know if I would hurt you the way everyone else has. Vincent did not deny it. Eve looked at the man before her, the bandaged shoulder, the bruised temple. The eyes that had made grown men confess things they had sworn to hide. For 12 years, she had watched people fear Vincent Moretti. She had respected him, questioned him, hated him on some days, defended him on others. But in that moment, she saw something almost unbearably sad. A man who had built an empire because he did not know how to ask anyone to stay. That is the saddest thing about you, she said. Not that you do not trust people, but that when someone finally earns it, you punish them for getting too close. Vincent's mouth tightened. For a second, she thought he might speak, apologize, defend himself, order her to sit down, anything. He did none of those things. Eve reached into her coat pocket and removed her access card. The small black card had opened every door in his office, every restricted elevator, every room where powerful men assumed she was only there to take notes. She placed it on the desk beside the box. Vincent looked at it like it was a sentence being passed. Evelyn, he said. She shook her head once. Your secretary will report tomorrow morning, because the clinic still needs protection, because Miles is still moving, because Adrian is still dangerous. But Evelyn Hart is done being tested tonight. She turned and walked to the door. This time. Vincent did not stop her. When Eve left the library, the hallway seemed longer than before. Rosa stood near the staircase, waiting, but said nothing. Eve was grateful for that. If someone had offered kindness too quickly, she might have broken. Inside the library, Vincent remained at the desk. The access card lay in front of him, black and small, and heavier than any gun he had ever held. He had pretended to lose his memory to expose betrayal, but now, sitting alone with the truth Eve had thrown back at him, Vincent understood the part he had not planned for. A man could uncover every enemy in his house and still lose the one person who had been guarding the best part of him. Vincent Moretti did not go to Evelyn Hart's apartment like a boss visiting an employee. He did not send a car ahead. He did not send a guard to knock first. He did not call from the street and tell her to come down. For the first time in 12 years, he stood outside her door with no office between them, no desk, no title, no schedule, and no power he could use without proving every accusation she had thrown at him in the library. It was almost midnight. The hallway of Eve's apartment building smelled faintly of laundry detergent, old carpet, and someone's late dinner. It was not a building Vincent would have chosen for her. That thought came to him automatically, and he hated himself for it. Even now, some part of him wanted to replace, protect, improve, control. He had spent half his life mistaking those words for love. He lifted his hand and knocked. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then he heard movement inside. The lock turned. The door opened. Eve stood there in a plain sweater and dark pants, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face tired in a way he had never seen at the office, at work. Evelyn Hart wore exhaustion like armor, here, in the narrow doorway of her own home. She looked like a woman who had finally put the armor down and did not appreciate finding war on the other side of it. She looked at him for a long moment. No guards, she asked, in the car. So there are guards, not in this hallway. That may be progress for you. He accepted the insult because it was deserved. I lied by omission. Eve's expression did not change. That is still lying. You just made it quieter. Vincent looked down once, then back at her. Yes, that single word did more than an argument would have. Eve had expected defense. Men like Vincent carried explanations the way other men carried wallets. Always ready, always worn from use. but he had come with none, or at least with fewer than she expected. She stepped back from the door. 10 minutes. He entered. Her apartment was small, neat and warmer than he expected. Books on a shelf, a framed photograph of Daniel in a graduation gown, a half-finished cup of tea on the kitchen counter. No expensive furniture. No careless luxury. Nothing in the room came from him, and that struck him harder than it should have. For 12 years, Evelyn had managed his world down to the minute, but he knew almost nothing about where she came home when the day was done. Eve did not offer him coffee. She sat in the chair near the window and left him standing. Vincent took that too. I found out about Thomas too late, he said. Her eyes sharpened, but she did not speak. Miles had already cleaned the paper trail. The police report was dead. The insurance investigation was buried. The company that owned the warehouse had changed names twice. By the time I understood what had happened, there was no clean way to bring it to court without exposing you and Daniel to people who would not have hesitated. Eve listened with her hands folded in her lap. Vincent went on. I kept the file because I knew one day Miles would reach for something too big. Men like him always do. I paid Daniel's school fees because Thomas died inside my world, even if I did not give the order. I watched from a distance because I thought distance kept you safe. Eve finally spoke. You thought wrong, yes. You decided what I could survive. The words settled between them. No shouting, no dramatic break. Just the truth. Spoken by someone who had earned the right to say it. Vincent nodded once. I did, for a moment. Eve looked away toward the window. Outside the city was quiet, only a few cars passing below. Do you know what the worst part is? She asked. That I didn't tell you. No, she looked back at him. The worst part is that I understand why you didn't. That is what makes me angry, because understanding a cage does not make it less locked. Vincent had no answer to that. He had built his life around answers, around leverage, strategy, timing, pressure, yet this woman, in a small apartment with tea going cold on the counter, had brought him to a place where all his weapons sounded childish. I am sorry, he said. Eve studied him. For lying, or for being caught. For making your grief another thing I thought I had the right to manage. That landed differently. She did not forgive him, not visibly, but something in the room shifted, the way air shifts before a storm decides whether to break or pass. Eve leaned back. In the hospital, she said, why did you cry? Vincent looked toward the photograph of Daniel because it was easier than looking at her. Because everyone else came into that room, looking for the boss. Adrian wanted weakness, Miles wanted signatures, Luca wanted his father, and I hurt him because I was afraid to stop the act. He paused. But you came in and reminded me of my mother. Eve said nothing. My mother made me promise to keep that clinic alive. I was 24, angry at God, angry at the doctors, angry at her for leaving me with a promise I did not know how to keep. She told me if I could not save my soul, I should save someone else's child. His voice grew rougher, though he did not raise it. For years. I told myself the clinic proved there was still something decent in me. Then I stopped thinking about it. I let you send the checks. I let you remember the dates. I let you carry the cleanest part of my life because I was too ashamed to touch it. Eva's face softened, but only slightly. When you walked into that hospital room, Vincent said, you did not ask for my money. You did not ask for my memory. You did not ask if I knew your name. You reminded me of the only promise I ever made before I became what I am. He looked at her then. Everyone came to see how much of the boss was left. You were the only one who came looking for the man. For a long time. The apartment was silent. Eve stood and walked to the kitchen counter. She did not comfort him. She did not come close. She simply picked up her cold tea and poured it into the sink. When she turned back, her voice was steady. I am loyal to the promise, she said. I am loyal to the people that promise protects. I am loyal to the man I have seen you try to be. But I am not loyal to being tested like a servant. Vincent nodded. I know. No, she said. You are learning. That hurt more because it was fair. What do you want from me? He asked. The truth before it becomes useful. He looked at her. No more deciding what I can survive, Eve said. No more protecting me by keeping me blind. No more tests disguised as strategy. If you want my help, you tell me what you know when you know it. Vincent held her gaze. Agreed. Before either of them could say more, Eve's phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at the screen, and every bit of warmth left her face. Vincent saw it. What is it? Eve picked up the phone. On the screen was a photograph of Daniel leaving the hospital in blue scrubs, his backpack over one shoulder. Unaware he was being watched. Beneath the image was one line. Your loyalty has a family too. Vincent's first instinct was old, immediate and violent. His shoulders changed, his eyes went cold. The man who had sat in her apartment trying to apologize disappeared under the man the waterfront feared. I'll handle it, he said. Eve looked up sharply. No, Evelyn, no. She placed the phone on the counter between them. If you hurt Adrian now, Miles turns you into exactly what he needs for court. Dangerous, unstable, unfit. If you expose him, he has nowhere to hide. Vincent forced himself to breathe. You have a plan. I have 8 years of one. She walked to a narrow cabinet near the bookcase, unlocked the bottom drawer, and removed a laptop and 2 hard drives. Vincent watched as she opened a folder labeled only with a date. Inside were subfolders: Grady edits, Adrian transfers, clinic interference, Thomas timeline, shell companies, witness notes. Vincent stared at the screen. Eve clicked through document after document. Emails Miles had altered. Transfer records Adrian thought had disappeared. Notes from meetings where the clinic budget had been targeted. Scanned invoices tied to the payments Miles had tried to make look dirty. A timeline beginning with Thomas Hart's final investigation and ending with the morning Vincent was shot. You built this, Vincent said. Yes. How long? Eve looked at the screen, not at him. Since the first day I realized your enemies were more careless than you. A pause. 8 years. Vincent felt something in him go still. While he had been testing her, doubting her, hiding truth from her in the name of safety, Eve had been doing what no soldier in his house had managed to do. She had been protecting the promise, protecting the clinic, protecting Daniel, protecting him, even from the parts of his own world he refused to see. Eve closed the laptop halfway and looked at him. You tested my loyalty, she said. Now let me show you what loyalty has been doing while you were busy doubting it. For the first time in many years, Vincent Moretti did not give an order, he listened by sunrise. Evelyn Hart's apartment had become something Vincent Moretti's mansion had never managed to be, useful without being loud. The small kitchen table was covered with printed records, legal pads, a laptop, 2 hard drives, and 3 cups of coffee no one had finished. Vincent sat stiffly near the window, his wounded shoulder aching beneath the sling, while Eve moved between the table and the counter with a calm that made the room feel larger than it was. She had slept less than 2 hours. It did not show in her hands. Vincent had always believed strategy came from silence, pressure, and the right amount of fear. Eve's strategy came from patience. She did not want to strike Adrian. She wanted Adrian to step exactly where his own arrogance had already placed the trap. That made Vincent restless. We can end this before noon, he said. Eve did not look up from the document she was marking. No, you can make a mess before noon. His eyes narrowed. There is a difference between a mess and a warning. Yes, Eve said. A warning is what men give when they want credit for restraint. A mess is what they leave for women with folders to clean up. Vincent stared at her for a moment, then looked away. Under different circumstances, he might have admired the sentence. Under these, he knew she was right. Adrian and Miles were not trying to win in an alley. They were trying to win in court, in boardrooms, through medical language and legal authority. If Vincent moved like the man they wanted him to be, Miles would have everything he needed: proof of instability, proof of danger, proof that Vincent Moretti could not be trusted to control his own empire. Eve tapped one finger against the paper in front of her. They need me scared. They need me isolated. They need me angry enough to make a mistake. So we let them believe it is working. Vincent's voice hardened. They threatened your son. Yes, she said, and that is why we do not give them the reaction they prepared for. There was a strength in her that did not announce itself. It simply stood there, like a locked door. Before the meeting, Eve went to see Daniel. She found him outside the hospital after his night shift, sitting on a low concrete wall with a paper cup of coffee in both hands. He looked tired, young, and too much like Thomas for Eve to breathe normally for a second. Daniel stood when he saw her. Mom, he said, what's going on? Eve had spent most of his life choosing which truths to keep away from him. That morning, she stopped. Some dangerous people are trying to use me to get to Vincent Moretti, she said. One of them sent me a picture of you last night. Daniel's face changed. Me, yes, because of your job. Eve looked at him carefully, because of my choices. He ran a hand through his hair and looked toward the hospital entrance, where nurses and patients came and went under fluorescent light. Is he worth this? Eve did not answer quickly. She loved her son too much to lie to him with a simple yes. No man is worth losing yourself for, she said. But some promises are worth protecting until they can belong to better people. Daniel studied her, and Dad. The question hurt because it was quiet. Eve touched his cheek once, the way she had when he was a boy. This is partly for him, too, that afternoon. Eve walked into a private law office on the 23rd floor of a glass-built building, overlooking the Hudson. She wore a dark blue suit, low heels, and no jewelry except her wedding ring on a chain beneath her blouse. She had told Vincent to stay away until the right moment. He hated the instruction, he followed it anyway. Adrian and Miles were waiting in a conference room that smelled of polished wood and expensive air. Miles stood when she entered. Adrian did not. Miss Hart, Miles said smoothly, thank you for coming. I did not come for thanks. Adrian smiled. No, you came because you understand the situation. Eve sat across from them. On the table was a document with her name printed near the bottom. She read the first page, then the second. Miles had written it beautifully. That was his talent. He could turn theft into stewardship, betrayal into concern, and fear into medical prudence. The statement said Vincent Moretti was mentally unfit to manage his affairs. It said Evelyn Hart, as longtime secretary, had observed signs of confusion before and after the shooting. It said temporary authority should be transferred to Adrian in the interest of family stability. Eve picked up the pen. Adrian leaned back, satisfied, for 1 second. Even Miles looked relieved. Then Eve says, you misspelled incapacity. Miles blinked. She placed the pen down. You always make small mistakes when you rush a lie. Adrian's smile disappeared. Careful. No, Eve said. You should be careful. I have been careful for 12 years. It is exhausting, but it teaches a person where men hide knives. Miles shut the folder halfway. This is not productive. It is very productive. Eve said, you threatened my son. You framed clinic payments as theft. You tried to use a real head injury to steal authority from a man you failed to kill cleanly. Adrian's palm hit the table. You have no idea what you are talking about. Eve looked at him, then correct me. That was the bait. Adrian took it because men like him hated being spoken to like boys. Vincent was done. He has been done for years. He kept wasting money on widows and children and old promises. The shooting was supposed to force the transition before he dragged all of us down with him. Miles stood sharply. Adrian. But the room next door had already heard enough. Luca Moretti stood behind a paneled wall with an independent attorney and doctor. Hannah Cole beside him, his face drained of color as the legal recording continued. He had thought Adrian understood his pain. He had thought Adrian was the only one willing to say out loud what Vincent had failed to be as a father. Now he heard the truth beneath it. His wound had not been respected. It had been used. The conference room door opened. Vincent walked in slowly, one arm in a sling, his face pale but his eyes clear. He did not look confused. He did not look broken. He looked exactly like the man Adrian had been afraid would wake up. The mistake, Vincent said, was never thinking I forgot. Adrian went still. Vincent's eyes moved to Eve. The mistake was thinking she would. Miles recovered first. This is theatrics. One conversation changes nothing. Eve closed the folder and stood. That is why this was never the whole case. From the doorway behind Vincent, Luca stepped into view. He looked at Adrian first, then at his father. Something in him was breaking. But not in the old way. This time, it was the lie that broke. Did you know I wasn't part of it? Luca asked. Vincent looked at his son, for once. No performance stood between them. I hoped, he said. Luca's eyes filled with a hurt Vincent had earned long before the shooting. That is not the same as trusting me. No one spoke. For all the planning, all the files, all the traps sprung and secrets exposed. That sentence was the one that stayed in the room longest. Miles Grady did not look afraid when Vincent Moretti walked into the conference room. Men like Miles had spent too many years hiding behind language to fear a moment too quickly. His face went still, his shoulders straightened, and almost at once the shock in his eyes disappeared behind a lawyer's calm. Adrian, on the other hand, had no such discipline. His anger came first, then disbelief, then the first thin line of fear. "This proves nothing," Miles said, closing the folder with slow, careful hands. "An emotional outburst from my client's nephew, a confused appearance by an injured man, and a secretary who appears to have been orchestrating access to him while he was medically vulnerable." Evelyn Hart looked at him from across the table. She had expected this. Miles would not deny the trap. He would reframe it. That was what he did. He took theft and called it stewardship. He took betrayal and called it concern. He took loyalty and tried to dress it up as manipulation. Vincent started to speak, but Eve lifted one hand. Not much, just enough. To everyone else in the room, it might have looked like a small gesture. To Vincent, it felt like a command. For once, he obeyed. Eve turned to the independent attorney standing near Luca. "We ready for the next step." The next step came faster than Miles expected. By morning, Miles had filed a formal petition questioning Vincent's mental competence. He accused Eve of exploiting Vincent's injury, blocking family access, mismanaging charitable funds, and using her position as secretary to control information. The language was polished enough to sound responsible. The accusation beneath it was ugly enough to ruin a woman who had spent 12 years making sure powerful men did not ruin everyone else. The press caught the scent by noon. By evening, headlines were moving across local business sites and crime blogs. Moretti Empire in crisis, longtime secretary under review. Charity funds questioned after boss shooting. Eve read one headline on her phone, then placed it face down on the kitchen table at the clinic. Margaret Wells, the clinic director, looked sick with worry. "They making it sound like you stole from sick children," Margaret whispered. "No," Eve said. "They were hoping I spend my energy defending my character instead of proving their crime." "Does that hurt?" Eve was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Of course it hurts. That is why it is useful to them." The legal meeting took place 2 days later in a private office downtown, with attorneys, investigators, Dr. Hannah Cole, Luca, Vincent, Eve, and a representative from the clinic board present. Miles arrived in a dark suit, carrying himself like a man inconvenienced by lesser minds. Adrian sat beside him, pale but still arrogant enough to look insulted by consequences. Miles's attorney began with Eve. He asked when she first gained access to Vincent's accounts. He asked why she had blocked family members from reviewing documents. He asked whether she had a personal relationship with Vincent. He asked whether Vincent had ever given her gifts, money, or promises. He asked whether she considered herself qualified to decide what his own son could see. The questions were designed to make her small. Eve answered with dates. She gave them authorization memos, emergency protocols, archived emails, board approvals, invoices, payroll schedules, and medical restrictions signed long before the shooting. Every time the attorney tried to pull her into emotion, she returned to paper. Finally, he leaned back and asked, "Miss Hart, what exactly were you to Mr. Moretti?" For the first time that morning, Eve allowed herself to look directly at Miles. "The person who read what powerful men signed without reading," she said. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Dr. Hannah Cole gave her statement. Vincent had suffered a real concussion, she confirmed. He had required monitoring. He had experienced pain, dizziness, and some short-term confusion, but at no point, based on her medical evaluation, had he been legally incompetent to understand his affairs. The attempt to declare him unfit, she said, had been premature, aggressive, and unsupported by the medical record. Miles's face did not move, but his left hand tightened around his pen. That was when Eve opened the Thomas Hart file. She did not make a speech, she did not cry. She placed the documents in order and let the room follow the trail. Insurance claims tied to waterfront warehouses. Legal reviews signed by Miles Grady. Shell company transfers routed through an entity Adrian had controlled years earlier. Internal notes altered after Thomas started asking questions. Payments made after his death. Clinic funds later mislabeled to make Eve look guilty. The evidence did not explode. It accumulated. That was worse for Miles. One page could be explained, 2 pages could be challenged. But a pattern was harder to kill, especially when the pattern had dates, signatures, and bank records attached. Adrian broke first. This was his system, he snapped, pointing at Miles. He told me what to sign. He said it was protected. Miles turned on him with a look sharp enough to cut glass. You arrogant child. And just like that, the polished alliance cracked open in front of everyone. Vincent watched without speaking. Years ago, he would have handled this differently. There would have been no legal meeting, no investigators, no careful evidence folders. Men who betrayed him disappeared from rooms and reappeared as warnings. But Eve had been right. Violence would have made him look unstable. Patience made his enemies reveal themselves. When the meeting ended, Adrian was taken into a separate room with investigators. Miles stayed behind long enough to gather his papers, though his hands were no longer steady. Vincent found Adrian in the hallway before they escorted him out. You got soft, Adrian said, his voice full of poison and panic. Vincent looked at him for a long time. No, I got tired of calling cruelty strength. Adrian laughed once, but it sounded broken. You'll let the law touch family. Family stopped protecting you the night you tried to kill it. There was nothing left to say after that. By sunset, the first wave of legal protections had shifted. The clinic funds were released. Miles S. petition was suspended pending investigation. Adrian S. accounts were frozen. Reporters outside the building shouted Vincent S. name. But he walked past them in silence. Everyone thought the worst was over. Vincent thought so too. Until he returned to the Moretti office and found Eve standing beside her desk with a cardboard box half full of files, a framed photo of Daniel, and the old brass nameplate that had sat outside his office for 12 years. He stopped in the doorway. What are you doing? Eve did not look guilty. She did not look angry either. She looked tired and certain. Leaving, she said, placing one last folder in the box. Before you mistake gratitude for permission to keep me. Vincent stood there with the whole empire nearly back in his hands. And for the first time that day, he felt the cost of winning. For 12 years, Evelyn Hart's desk had stood outside Vincent Moretti's office, like a quiet checkpoint between the man and the world. Powerful men had stopped there and learned patience. Lawyers had left papers there and learned fear. Family members had smiled at her from the wrong side of the door and discovered that a secretary with a calendar could be more difficult to move than a bodyguard with a gun. Now the desk was almost empty. Vincent stood in the doorway and watched Eve place the last folder into the cardboard box. It was not one of his folders. That bothered him more than it should have. She had separated everything cleanly, of course. Moretti files in one stack, clinic files in another, her personal things in the box. Even leaving him, Evelyn Hart was organized. You don't have to do this tonight, he said. Eve did not stop packing. Yes, I do. The petition is suspended. Miles is under investigation. Adrian is contained. The clinic funds are released. I know. Then why are you leaving? She looked up at him then, not angry, not cold, just tired in a way that made him feel old. Because if I sit behind this desk tomorrow, everyone will call it loyalty, she said. You might even call it love one day. But I will know I never left the room where you tested me. Vincent absorbed the words slowly. He had taken bullets with less visible reaction. I made a mistake. Yes, I told you the truth. After the truth became useful, that silenced him. Eve lifted the framed photograph of Daniel from the desk and wrapped it in a scarf before placing it in the box. Vincent had seen that photo for years without really seeing it. Daniel in a graduation gown, smiling too widely. Eve standing beside him with one hand on his shoulder. A life existed in that frame that did not belong to Vincent. And he had spent 12 years forgetting that. I can make sure you are protected, he said. Eve's mouth softened, but not into a smile. That is still you trying to solve pain with control. He looked down. I am not leaving because I am afraid, she continued. I am leaving because my name has to exist somewhere before my usefulness does. The sentence landed clean and deep. Vincent wanted to argue. He wanted to say that she was more than useful, that she was trusted, necessary, irreplaceable. But every word he could have used sounded like another chain. So he asked the only question that did not insult her. Where will you go? Eve closed the box, somewhere quiet for a while, and after that, somewhere honest. Vincent nodded once. Then they better deserve it. For the first time that night, she almost smiled. The next morning, the estate felt different, not safer, not peaceful. Just stripped of one illusion. Adrian S. rooms were being searched by investigators. Miles S. office had been locked pending review. The men who had once drifted through the house with false confidence now moved carefully, speaking in low voices, as if the walls had learned to testify. Luca found Vincent in the old breakfast room, where neither of them had eaten breakfast in years. Vincent was standing by the window, looking toward the back lawn, his injured arm still supported in a sling. Luca stopped near the doorway. "You wanted to see me?" he asked. Vincent turned. For a moment, he saw not the angry young man Adrian had used, but the boy who used to wait at the top of the stairs for a father who came home too late and spoke too little. "Yes," Vincent said. "Sit down." Luca did not sit. "I'd rather stand." Vincent accepted that. "I taught you how to survive my world. I forgot to ask if you wanted to live in it." Luca's face tightened. Vincent continued before courage left him. "I thought keeping you away from the worst parts of me was protection. But all I did was leave you alone with the silence." Luca looked toward the table. "I wanted you to choose me without needing a crisis." The words were quiet, but they carried years. Vincent felt them in the one place no doctor could examine. "You deserved that." Luca laughed once. Bitter and sad. "You say that like it fixes something. It does. Then what does it do?" Vincent took a breath. "It tells you I know the debt is mine." Luca finally looked at him. Something in his expression shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a small movement away from the edge. "I hated that you trusted her," Luca said. "Evelyn." Luca nodded. "I thought she took my place." Vincent shook his head slowly. "No, she stood in a place I left empty." That answer hurt them both. Later that week, the Moretti Clinic held an emergency board meeting in a plain room above the main reception area. No marble, no armed men at the door. Just folding chairs, coffee in paper cups, tired doctors, nurses, accountants, and people who looked like they had spent years keeping something alive with less money than it deserved. Eve attended as a guest. Not as Vincent's secretary. That distinction mattered to her. It mattered so much that when the board chair introduced her as Mr. Moretti's longtime assistant, she corrected him gently. "Former assistant." The room went quiet for half a second, then moved on. The board discussed what everyone already knew. The clinic could not continue as a private extension of Vincent's guilt. If it survived only because one dangerous man remembered to write checks, then it would always be vulnerable to his enemies, his family, his injuries and his sins. It needed independent governance, outside audits, a protected endowment, and a leader who knew both the paperwork and the people. Margaret Wells looked across the table at Eve. "We want you to serve as executive director." Eve did not answer immediately. Vincent sat at the far end of the room, silent. He had insisted the offer not come from him. He had insisted his vote be recorded but not spoken. It was the first decent structure he could think of that did not require Eve to trust his mood, his power, or his remorse. Eve looked at the board documents. The terms were clear. She would not report to Vincent. The clinic would be audited independently. The Moretti family could not interfere with staffing, medical priorities, or emergency funds. Vincent's money could support the clinic, but it could no longer own its conscience. After the meeting, Eve found Vincent standing in the hallway beneath an old photograph of Rose Moretti with a group of children outside the original clinic. "Is this an apology disguised as a job?" she asked. Vincent looked at the photograph before answering. "No, it is the first honest structure I should have built years ago." Eve studied him. "You understand I would not work for you?" "Yes. You would not be able to call my office and move things because you dislike waiting." "I dislike many necessary things." That was not an answer. Vincent looked at her then. "I understand." She nodded, but she did not say yes. That evening, Rosabelle found Eve in the old kitchen at the estate. Eve had come to collect one last box of clinic records and had ended up standing by the sink, staring out at the garden where Rose Moretti used to grow basil in the summers. Rosa placed a photograph on the counter. In it, Vincent was young, maybe 22, standing beside his mother in front of the clinic. His hair was dark, his smile unguarded. He looked like a man who had not yet mistaken hardness for survival. He was not always like this, Rosa said. Eve touched the edge of the photograph. No one is born like this. He became hard because he thought it would keep him alive, Rosa said. Then he survived too long that way. Eve looked at the younger Vincent in the picture. For a moment, she could see the man who had cried in the hospital room. Not because he forgot himself, but because someone else had remembered. Rosa's voice softened. Do not go back to being his secretary. If you return, return as yourself. Eve gave the photograph back. That is the only way I know how now. 6 weeks later, the clinic reopened under its new structure. Eve arrived in a simple navy suit, carrying no files for Vincent, no schedule, no messages from men waiting outside his door. She walked past the cameras, past the donors, past the Moretti relatives, who still did not know what to call her without the word secretary. At the front of the room, the board chair waited. Near the back, Vincent stood alone. He did not call her over. He did not send anyone to bring her to him. He did not claim her attention in front of the room. He simply watched her choose where to stand. And, for Vincent Moretti, that was the beginning of learning how to love without reaching for control. The Moretti Clinic did not look like the kind of place that could change a man's life. It was a brick building on a tired street, with old radiators, crowded waiting rooms, and coffee that tasted like it had been made by someone too busy saving people to care about flavor. But that morning, as the doors reopened under a new nameplate and a new board, Vincent Moretti stood near the back of the room and understood that his mother had been right. Mercy did not need marble floors. It only needed someone willing to keep the door open. Reporters crowded near the entrance. Donors stood in small groups, pretending they had always cared. Nurses moved between patients with clipboards in their hands and relief in their faces. A little boy in a red jacket sat beside his mother, swinging his feet beneath a chair, unaware that grown men had nearly destroyed the place that would treat him. Vincent watched him for a moment and felt the old ache return. Not the pain in his shoulder, but something older and harder to name. Evelyn Hart stood at the front of the room, no longer behind his desk, no longer carrying his folders, no longer introduced as his secretary. She wore a simple navy suit and spoke with the same calm voice that had once stopped men from signing the wrong papers. But this time, the room listened to her because the authority was hers. The board chair announced that Evelyn Hart had accepted the role of independent executive director. Applause rose around the room, modest at first, then warmer. Eve waited until it settled before she spoke. I accept on one condition, she said. This clinic will not survive because a powerful man feels guilty. It will survive because good people build systems stronger than guilt. Several people looked toward Vincent. He lowered his head. There had been a time when those words would have embarrassed him, maybe even angered him. Now they felt like the cleanest truth anyone had spoken about him in years. His mother had built the clinic out of mercy. Vincent had kept it alive out of guilt, pride, love, and fear. Eve was giving it something better. A future that did not depend on whether one dangerous man remembered to be decent. After the ceremony, a reporter caught Vincent near the hallway. Mr. Moretti, is it true you suffered memory loss after the shooting? Vincent could have walked away. He could have let a lawyer answer. He could have lied with the ease of a man who had practiced silence for decades. Instead, he looked across the room at Eve. I was injured, he said. I was afraid. And for a short time, I let people believe I remembered less than I did, because I wanted to know who they were when I looked weak. The reporter leaned closer. And what did you learn? Vincent's eyes did not leave Eve. Power attracts loyalty's costume, he said. Weakness reveals loyalty's face. He left the reporter with that and walked down the hallway beneath the framed photograph of Rose Moretti. Eve was there, reading a note from one of the nurses. She looked up when he approached. I don't want my secretary back, Vincent said. Eve folded the note. Good, she resigned. For the first time in weeks, something like a real smile touched his face. I would like to know Evelyn Hart, he said. If she allows it, that was the difference. Once, he would have made room in his life and expected her to step into it. Now he asked. Eve studied him for a long moment. You may ask dinner, Vincent said. No guards at the table, no business, no tests, and no lies by omission. He nodded. No lies by omission. Then dinner. Later that evening, they sat in a small diner far from the clinic, far from the waterfront, far from the rooms where men measured power by fear. No one there knew enough to lower their voices when Vincent entered. That seemed to please Eve more than it should have. 2 cups of coffee sat between them. The silence was no longer dangerous. Vincent looked at her and asked, "When you walked into that hospital room, did you know I remembered?" "Not completely." "Then why say what you said?" Eve's face softened, not with pity, but with something steadier. "Because whether you remembered me or not," she said, "someone had to remind you who you were before everyone else told you what you owned." Vincent went quiet. This time, when tears came, he did not turn away. Eve reached across the table and placed a napkin beside his hand. It was a small gesture. Familiar. She had done things like that 1,000 times as his secretary. But this time, she did it because she cared. Vincent looked at the napkin, then at her. "I don't deserve that kind of loyalty," he said. Eve's voice was gentle, but firm. "No one deserves it. They become worthy of it, one choice at a time." Outside, the city moved on. Cars passed, rain began again, soft against the diner window. Vincent Moretti had pretended to lose his memory to discover who would betray him. But the truth was, the one person he tested had been remembering for him all along. Not the empire, not the money, not the fear. She remembered the promise, and sometimes, the person who saves you is not the one who fights your enemies. It is the one who refuses to let you forget the best part of yourself, the characters, settings, and events portrayed in this story are entirely fictional. While certain themes may echo real-life experiences, they are shaped by creative interpretation. The author does not intend to represent or depict any specific individual, organization, or historical event.
The meaning of this story is not simply about a mafia boss pretending to lose his memory. It is about what happens when power becomes quiet, when fear no longer works, and when the people around you finally show who they really are. Vincent Moretti believed that loyalty had to be tested. He had lived too long in a world where people smiled while planning betrayal, where family could become enemies, and where every signature could hide a knife. So, when he pretended to have amnesia, he thought he was protecting himself. But the truth is, he was also revealing the deepest wound inside him. He did not believe anyone could stay unless they feared him or needed him. Evelyn Hart proved something different. She did not stay because Vincent was powerful. She did not protect him because she was weak, dependent, or blind. She stayed loyal to the promise, to the clinic, to the widows, to the children, and to the part of Vincent that still deserved to be saved. But she also showed that true loyalty must have dignity. Loyalty without self-respect becomes a cage. Loyalty with wisdom becomes strength. This story teaches us that real power is not control. Real power is having the courage to tell the truth, to protect people who cannot repay you, and to admit when your fear has hurt the people who stood beside you. Vincent won back his empire, but his real victory was not defeating Adrian or Miles. His real victory was learning that loyalty is not something you own. It is something you become worthy of, one choice at a time. And sometimes, the person who saves you is not the one who fights your enemies. It is the one who reminds you of the best part of yourself,